Part 21. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 202. The spring breeze is so proud and the horses' hooves are so anxious that I can see all the flowers in Chang'an in one day. This poem by Meng Jiao vividly describes the mood of the Nujinshi. For many people, this is the most glorious moment in their lives. The team marched very slowly. After a long time, the people along the way may still feel it was new, but Xiaoju next to them was already a little impatient. Further ahead is the Ping'an County Government Office. Xiao Ru Xiao I will be there to watch, and she cannot embarrass herself in front of Fairy Tang. Tang Ning braced herself and suddenly heard a commotion beside her. A beggar was trying his best to squeeze in, but two guards stopped him from outside. Tang Ning recognized that the beggar was Lu Lao, her subordinate, pulled the horse's head, walked to the left, and said to the two guards, "Stop it first." After the two guards stopped, he looked at the beggar and asked, "What happened?" "Help." The beggar gasped and changed his words in an emergency, saying, "We found the little beggar you asked us to find." Tang Ning was stunned for a moment, then jumped off the horse, grabbed his wrist, and asked, "Where is it?" "Hey, what happened?" Xiaoju looked at him in confusion. Before he could finish his sentence, he watched in shock as he and the beggar rushed out of the crowd and disappeared in an instant. The onlookers on the street were already in an uproar. Why did the champion run away? What happened? Where has the number one scholar gone? What's going on? Several guards responsible for maintaining order were also stunned on the spot, unable to recover for a while. At this critical moment, the number one scholar actually ran away. After several people reacted, they immediately said, "Hurry up and chase." At the Qianglan banquet in the evening, Your Majesty will personally confer an official to the number one scholar. If he runs away, who will Your Majesty confer? A guard came to the front and asked an official, "Sir, what should we do?" The official also had a look of shock and confusion on his face, but he reacted the next moment and said, "There aren't many left anyway, keep moving forward." The guard nodded, turned around and said, "Keep moving forward." After he said this, his expression was startled again. Because there were only two horses left in the rear, and all the people on the horses were missing. Capital, North District. Although the capital is a prosperous place in the capital, it is not filled with dignitaries and rich businessmen. Ordinary people still make up the majority, and there is no shortage of poor people who are struggling to survive. The North District of the capital is where the poor gather. There are no tall mansions here, but only a large number of low and dilapidated houses. The people living there are also poor people. Because of the remoteness of the place, the public order is extremely chaotic. Even the government officials, they don't want to get involved too much. In the North District, deep in the crisscrossing streets, there is a house that is dilapidated but occupies a vast area. A beggar held a wooden stick in his hand, pointed at a figure huddled in the corner, and sneered, "Hey, aren't you very good at running? Just keep running." The figure retreated to the corner, with no way out. In this courtyard, there are more than a dozen figures, all of whom are young children. They are both male and female. They are in ragged clothes and have sallow faces. They are leaning against the wall with no sparkle in their eyes. You ran away as soon as I arrived in the capital, causing me to be scolded by my eldest brother. The beggar tightened the wooden stick in his hand, pointed at the little beggar, and said loudly as he walked forward, I'll break your legs this time and see if you can still run." He swore angrily, walked to the corner, raised the wooden stick in his hand, and brought it down hard. The little beggar raised his head, and his bright eyes lost their light for the first time. Boom! Just as the stick in the beggar's hand was about to fall, someone kicked the courtyard door open. He paused, looked back, immediately dropped the stick in his hand, ran to the door with a flattering look on his face, and said, "Young master, why are you here in person? Brother is inside, I will call him right away. The young man stood in the courtyard. After a while, a strong man with a fleshy face and a scar on his forehead strode out from inside. The big man looked extremely ferocious, but the expression on his face was extremely flattering. He walked up to the young man and said, "Master, if you have any errands, just let the servants tell you. Why are you here in person?" "I'm bored, come and take a look." The young man looked at the man and asked, "Are you ready for this month's filial piety?" Hearing this, the big man looked slightly embarrassed and said, "Sir, there have been some minor problems this month. Please give me a few days of grace." "It only takes a few days." The young man frowned. "Slight situation." The man's heart trembled, and he immediately said, "A few days ago, there were some beggars from outside who ruined our good deeds several times. Don't worry, sir, I will summon my brothers to deal with them soon." The young man stopped asking about this matter, glanced around the courtyard, and asked, "Are there any suitable seedlings recently?" The strong man's expression immediately became solemn and he said, "If I go back to the young master, there are a few who are in good health and have stayed behind." The young man asked, "How many?" The strong man arrived immediately, 4. The young man shook his head and said, "Too little." The strong man's body trembled and he immediately said, "Please pay attention to the little one and find some good seedlings as soon as possible and send them to the capital." Boom! Just as the young man was about to speak, there was another loud noise from the courtyard door, and the door latch snapped. A beggar pointed to the courtyard and shouted, "Gang leader, this is it." Tang Ning walked in from outside the courtyard quickly and saw dozens of beggars in the courtyard and Tang Zhao standing in the courtyard. He looked at Tang Zhao and said in a deep voice, "It's you." Tang Zhao's face changed drastically, pointing at him and shouting, "Why are you here?" Xiaoju and several guards walked in from outside and asked in surprise, "Why did you run just now? What happened?" Tang Ning saw the figure at the corner at a glance, his expression was happy, and he walked over with big strides. "Stop!" Two beggars in the courtyard blocked him in front of him. Tang Ning's face turned cold, and after two muffled sounds, they fell to the ground and couldn't get up. "You stop!" Tang Zhao strode over and said in a deep voice, "This is not the place you should come to. If you dare to make trouble here, you will never be able to go back to the Tang family." In response, he was kicked in the chest. Tang Zhao flew backwards, hit the opposite wall, and fell heavily again, unconscious. "You can't go back like this." Tang Ning glanced at him and continued to walk to the corner. The little beggar in the corner saw Tang Ning coming and subconsciously ran towards the door. Halfway through, his body suddenly went limp. Tang Ning hurried forward and helped him up before he fell to the ground. He looked at Xiaoju and said, "I leave this place to you. Don't let anyone here go." After saying that, he picked up the little beggar and ran out of the door quickly. "What's going on?" Xiaoju looked at his figure disappearing outside the door in surprise. After a long time, he looked at the guards, waved his hands, and said, "Catch them first and interrogate them thoroughly." At Ping'an County Yamen, Qing'er stood at the Yamen gate, watching a team passing by on the street, and said in surprise, "Miss, where is the son-in-law? Didn't you say that the son-in-law would ride a big horse through here? I didn't see the son-in-law just now." Zhongyi also looked puzzled, and murmured, "No, my husband should be in the front." Qing'er stuck her head out and looked at the street. At a certain moment, she suddenly pointed her finger forward and said happily, "I saw the son-in-law." Tang Ning had just been to the clinic. The doctor said that the little beggar fainted from hunger. When he woke up, he would just have to eat something. He held the little beggar in his arms and walked quickly to the gate of the Yamen. Zhongyi looked at him and said in surprise, "Husband, why are you?" "I'll explain it to you in detail later." Tang Ning walked into the Yamen, looked back at Qing'er, and said, "Go prepare some hot water and bring it to my room." "Oh, Ching-er nodded and ran quickly to the backyard. Zhongyi looked at Tang Ning's back, and then looked at Su Ryu and Tang Yaoyao with surprise and confusion in his eyes. In Tang Ning's room, Ching-er walked in with a copper basin and said, "Son-in-law, the hot water is ready." Tang Ning took out a piece of his clothes from the cabinet. Although it was big, it was clean and could be used for the time being. He took the hot water and said to Ching-er, "Okay, you go out and get busy first." Ching-er looked at the little beggar lying on the bed and walked out in confusion. Tang Ning wet the towel, wiped his face, and then untied his tattered clothes. After a while, he walked out of the room and said, "Ching-er." Ching-er ran over quickly and asked, "Son-in-law, what's wrong?" Tang Ning waved awkwardly and said, "You better come in." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 203. Ching-er closed the door, and Tang Ning stood at the door. It took him a while to recover. The little beggar turned out to be a girl, which was different from what he had always imagined. With her usual attire, it would be hard to tell her gender if he hadn't accidentally seen her when she was taking off her clothes just now. However, no matter whether she was a man or a woman, she was his savior, and that was impossible to change. 11 come here, he waved to a maid in the mansion, and after whispering a few words, the maid named 11 walked out quickly. Zhongyi walked up and asked, "My husband, what happened? Who did you bring back just now?" Su Ryu and Tang Yaoyao also looked at him with confusion. Tang Ning looked at her and said, "I should have mentioned it to my wife. When I was in Lingzhou, I met a little beggar. At that time, he would always chat with Zhongyi in the room for a long time at night, and mentioned this matter more than once." Zhongyi looked at him and said with some joy, "Sir, have you found that little benefactor?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "She is the one in the room." Tang Yaoyao beside him was even more confused and asked, "What little benefactor?" Zhongyi walked into the courtyard and explained the little beggar to Su Ryu and Tang Yaoyao. Tang Ning paced outside the door, and the corners of his mouth rose unconsciously. Even when he won the first place in the imperial examination a few days ago, he was not as happy as he was now. From Lingzhou to the capital, it took nearly a year, and he finally found her. Tang Ning stood outside the door and suddenly heard Ching-er scream from inside. His face changed. When he pushed the door, he realized that it was locked from the inside. He pushed the door open with his shoulder. Seeing Ching-er sitting on the ground, he hurried forward and helped her up. Ching-er rubbed her buttocks and pointed at the bed and said, "Son-in-law, I just wiped her body and put on her clothes, and she woke up." Tang Ning's clothes seemed a little too big for the little beggar. She was huddled in the corner, looking at him and Ching-er with vigilant eyes. Tang Ning took a step forward, and she shrank back again, her expression even more vigilant. "Do you still remember me?" Tang Ning stopped and looked at her, trying to make his voice softer, and slowly said, "Last year in Lingzhou, in that alley, that bun, with cabbage filling." The little beggar looked at him, and something seemed to flash in his smart eyes. A maid named 11 ran in from outside and said, "Son-in-law, I bought the buns." Tang Ning took a bun from her hand, handed it over carefully, and said, "You gave me a bun last year, and now I'm giving it back to you." The little beggar looked at the bun in his hand, but did not reach out. Tang Ning looked at her, broke the bun in his hand into two halves, took a bite of one half, and then handed the remaining half to him. The little beggar looked at him for a long time, and finally stretched out his hand carefully. She took the half bun, took a bite carefully, and chewed it carefully. Tang Ning looked at Ching-er and said, "Ching-er, go prepare some porridge." "Oh, I'll go now," Ching-er nodded. As she walked out of the room, Tang Ning seemed to remember something and asked, "Do you have any thinner clothes that are suitable for her?" Ching-er straightened her chest, looked down at her figure, and said dissatisfiedly, "Sir, how am I fat?" Ching-er's figure was actually not fat at all. To be precise, the little beggar was too thin. Ching'er's clothes could not support her at all. However, she was very young and had been living outside. She was hungry and had no clothes to wear. It was not easy for her not to starve to death. Tang Yao Yao and Zhong Yi walked in from outside. Ching'er looked at Tang Yao Yao and suddenly said, "Sister Yao Yao and her figure are similar. Why don't you ask her if she has clothes from her childhood?" Tang Yao Yao looked at the little beggar, then looked down at herself and said angrily, "Ching'er, you have to explain to me clearly, what do you mean by our figures are similar?" Ching'er ran out in a flash. Tang Ning looked at Tang Yao Yao. Tang Yao Yao's figure was perfect, with a wasp waist and beautiful legs, but there was also a flaw. In this respect, she was similar to the little beggar who had been hungry for a long time and was malnourished. There were so many people in the room at once, and the little beggar hid in the corner of the bed, holding the bun tightly in his hand. Tang Ning walked carefully to the bedside and said, "Don't worry, no one here will hurt you." Zhong Yi looked at the bedside and saw that the little beggar still had a vigilant look on his face. He whispered to Tang Yao Yao and Su Are you, let's go out first. After they walked out, Tang Ning moved inside and said, "Thank you for the bun, otherwise, I would have starved to death." The little beggar lowered her head and ate the bun in small bites without saying a word. Tang Ning noticed that the vigilance on her face had dissipated a lot, and asked tentatively, "My name is Tang Ning, what's your name?" The little beggar continued to lower her head and didn't speak. Tang Ning looked at her and asked carefully, "Can't you speak?" "Xiao, xiao xiao xiao." She paused in eating the bun, and after a long time, a small sound came out. Although the sound was small, it was crisp and pleasant. "Xiao xiao xiao." Tang Ning repeated the name several times. Seeing that she had finished the bun in her hand, she hurriedly handed her another one, walked to the table, and poured her a glass of water. The little beggar took the bun, thought about it, broke it in half and handed half to Tang Ning. Tang Ning took half of the bun and took a bite. He felt that this was the most delicious cabbage bun he had eaten since that day. Ching'er quickly took out a piece of clothing she had worn a few years ago. When she moved, she was the one who brought the most things. This time, it came in handy. Tang Ning saw her clothes lying beside the bed and said, "Put on this first." He walked out of the door, closed it, and saw Xiaoju walking in from outside. "I sent someone to the county government office to notify your father-in-law. Your father-in-law sent people to arrest those beggars. By the way, Tang Zhao was taken away by the Tang family's servants." He looked at Tang Ning and suddenly asked, "Who did you take away just now?" "It's a long story." Tang Ning shook his head and said, "I'll explain it to you slowly when I have a chance." "Okay." Xiaoju shrugged and said, "But don't blame me for not reminding you of one thing. Your kick was a bit fierce. Tang Ersha must have broken a few ribs at least. The Tang family may cause trouble for you." Even if there was no today's incident, Tang Ning had thought about whether to do something to draw a clear line with the Tang family. The appearance of Tang Zhao just created such an opportunity for him. A large number of children were trafficked. Even if the Tang family was convicted of this crime, they would have to pay a heavy price. Ching'er pushed the door open and walked out, saying, "Sir, she's changed." Tang Ning walked in quickly. The little beggar had already changed into Ching'er's clothes. She was too thin. Even Ching'er's clothes from a few years ago were still a little big on her. Xiaoju looked at her and said in surprise, "She's actually a little girl." He looked at the little beggar with curiosity, then looked at Tang Ning again and said, "We should go back to the palace. There are still some etiquettes to go through. If we go too late, we may miss the evening banquet." The little beggar was still holding half a bun in his hand, standing behind Tang Ning, still a little wary of the surrounding environment. Tang Ning looked down at her, then looked at Xiaoju and said, "I have something here and can't leave. How about you ask for a leave for me tonight?" You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 204. Ask for leave. Xiao Ju looked at him with his arms folded, and asked, "What do you think?" Tang Ning sighed and said, "I don't think so. Rules are set by people. It's not that he can't ask for leave at the Qianglin banquet. Unfortunately, he couldn't find a better reason. If he was the one who broke a few ribs, it would be easy to ask for leave." Tang Ning looked down and saw the little beggar lowered his head and leaned towards him. He led her to the bed and said, "I'm going to do something. You eat something first, then take a nap. I'll come when you wake up." Tang Ning let her lie on the bed, covered her with a quilt, and used the method taught by Tang Yejing to press a certain acupointment on her shoulder. Not long after, her eyes slowly closed and she could breathe evenly. When she slept, she was like Sume, with her eyes half open, her little fists clenched tightly, and her body curled up, as if she would wake up at any time. It seems that it will take time to eliminate her defense against outsiders and the external environment. Tang Ning asked Qing'er to light some calming incense beside the bed, and then signaled Xiao Ju to walk out quietly. "Who is she, your sister?" Xiao Ju walked out of the room, looked up, and asked in confusion. Tang Ning gently closed the door and said, "Not before, but in the future. You are really good, you can also pick up a sister." Xiao Ju looked at him and said, "Now you should think about it carefully. You just ran away just now. How are you going to explain to His Majesty later?" Tang Ning looked at Xiao Ju and asked, "Didn't you run away too?" Xiao Ju thought about it, looked at him and asked, "Are you also His Majesty's brother-in-law?" Tang Ning really didn't have the power and background like Xiao Ju, and he was not the emperor's brother-in-law, so when he passed by the clinic, he wrapped a white cloth on his hand. The Jinchi team had to go around the capital in a full circle. The streets were lined with onlookers, and the pace of the march was very slow. When Tang Ning and Xiao Ju caught up with the team, they had not yet entered the palace gate. Seeing them coming, an official in the team ran forward and hurriedly said, "Hey, number 1 scholar, young master, you are finally here, hurry up and get on the horse." In previous years, when riding horses in the streets, there has never been a situation where the number 1 scholar ran away halfway through the parade and took someone with him. Both of them were wearing crowns and big red flowers on their chests. If you didn't know, you would think they eloped. After more than 200 Jinchi went around the capital, they entered the palace and were temporarily placed in a hall. About an hour later, His Majesty will grant official positions to some Jinchi, and then it will be the long-awaited Qianglin banquet. Tang Ning and Xiao Ju waited in the hall for a while, and then an eunuch came in and said, "The top scholar, the young master, the emperor summoned you. I wonder how the emperor will punish them. They don't even want this opportunity, I really don't know what they are thinking. But one is the young master and the other is the top scholar, the emperor shouldn't punish them severely." When the many scholars in the hall saw the two being summoned away, many of them showed a gloating look on their faces. When they were paraded just now, everyone saw the two of them jump off the horse and run away, which was a great disrespect. The emperor summoned them over, and he should be asking for punishment. I don't know what disease they had just had. It was such an honor to ride a horse in the parade under the witness of the people of the whole city, but they actually gave up this opportunity to make face. You know, except for them, all the scholars wanted to get on the two horses in front. The place where Emperor Chen summoned them was in the imperial room. When Tang Ning and Xiao Ju walked in, they saw several unfamiliar officials standing in the hall. Student pays respect to His Majesty. Xiao Ju pays respect to His Majesty. Tang Ning and Xiao Ju bowed at the same time. No need to be polite. Emperor Chen looked at the two of them and said straight to the point, "An imperial censor reported you two for abandoning your horses and running away during the imperial parade. This is a breach of etiquette. Is this true? Your Majesty, it is true. Xiaoju bowed and said, however, we have to act in an emergency. There is a reason why we did this. Emperor Chen leaned back in his chair, glanced at them, and said, tell me, what is the reason that made you ignore the imperial parade? Xiaoju looked at Tang Ning, and Tang Ning bowed and said, Your Majesty, my sister was kidnapped a year ago and has been missing. In the past year, I have been worried about my relatives and have never stopped looking for her. I just heard the news about my sister and knew that she was in danger. I was extremely anxious, so I was rude. Emperor Chen looked at him and said in surprise, You have a sister? That Tang Ning opened his lips and said, My sister. Emperor Chen looked at Xiaoju and asked, he was trying to save his sister, what were you trying to do? Xiaoju naturally wouldn't say he was trying to watch the fun. After a moment of hesitation, he changed the subject and said, Your Majesty, the champion and I found a gang that kidnapped children everywhere in the capital. They kidnapped these children from all over the country to the capital, made them pretend to be beggars, and used the sympathy of the people to defraud money. It is really a heinous crime. Please make a wise judgment, Your Majesty. Emperor Chen nodded and said, I have asked Ling Yun to investigate this case. After that, he looked at Tang Ning again, looked at his hand wrapped in white cloth, and asked, What happened to your hand? Tang Ning thought for a while and said, The student was injured in the fight with the villain just now. Fight? Emperor Chen looked at him and asked, Why did you hear that you kicked someone out of a distance of 10 feet, how could you hurt your hand? Tang Ning limped 2 steps and said, My foot is actually injured. An official stood up and said, Your Majesty, etiquette cannot be abolished without courtesy. Even the champion should observe etiquette. Another official echoed, The champion has disrespected etiquette and should be punished. Emperor Chen looked at them and said, Although the champion violated etiquette, he was worried about his relatives, which is understandable. He also solved such a big case. His merits and demerits offset each other. You don't need to say more. The 2 imperial censors looked at each other and lowered their heads and stopped talking. This matter can be big or small. Whether it is severe punishment or light punishment is all up to Your Majesty. This champion has always been favored by Your Majesty. I believe he will not be severely punished for this matter, not to mention that it involves the Xiao family. This matter will probably be passed lightly. Emperor Chen looked at them and asked, I heard that you met Tang Zhao of the Tang family there. Xiaoju bowed and said, Your Majesty, we suspect that Tang Ersha, the second young master of the Tang family, Tang Zhao, is closely related to this matter. Please investigate it, Your Majesty. Emperor Chen nodded and said, I have handed this matter over to Ling Yun. He looked at Xiaoju and asked, You are the first in the palace examination this time. According to the rules, you can enter the Hanlin Academy. Do you want to enter the Hanlin Academy or serve in the palace? Xiaoju thought for a while and said, Your Majesty, the Xiao family is a military family. I want to serve in the palace. Emperor Chen nodded, looked at Tang Ning again, and asked, I want you to enter the Hanlin Academy first and study for 2 years. Do you have any ideas? Tang Ning bowed and said, Your Majesty will arrange everything for the students. Tang Ning and Xiaoju walked out of the imperial room, and the matter was just passed by so lightly. Duke Dingguo had a son in his old age, and Emperor Chen treated his brother-in-law Xiaoju with great favor. Tang Ning felt that he should have benefited from Xiaoju. As for his entry into the Hanlin Academy, it was not surprising. In previous years, the top scholar would generally get a position as a Hanlin editor. Although it was just editing and giving lectures, without any real power, it was a stepping stone. Generally speaking, after a 2 to 3 year internship, one could officially enter the officialdom of the capital. When he and Xiaoju arrived at the hall, Gu Bai came forward and asked, How is it? His Majesty didn't punish you, did he? Xiaoju rolled his eyes at him and asked, "Why did His Majesty punish us?" Gu Bai asked in confusion, "Then why did His Majesty summon you?" Xiaoju said casually, "His Majesty asked us to go over to ask what kind of official we wanted to be. Tang Ning said he wanted to enter the Hanlin Academy, and I want to be on duty in the palace. That's all. That's all." The eyes of many Jinchi in the hall looking at them immediately became resentful. They were both Jinchi, but the difference in treatment was too great. The two of them ran away halfway through the parade, which was against etiquette. His Majesty not only did not punish them, but also asked them what official position they wanted to hold and which imperial examination they would take. They could not just take whatever was given to them. How could they have any choice? Even if it was a favor, there had to be a limit. The sum of the favors received by the Jinchi present was probably not as good as theirs. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 205. After Tang Ning and Xiaoju returned safely, all the scholars in the palace put their other thoughts aside. After this incident, if they still don't know the difference between these two people and themselves, the Jinchi exam will be in vain. Needless to say, Xiaoju, the Xiao family is a descendant. Although the queen died young, Your Majesty missed the old relationship and never established a new queen. Also because of the queen's death, he felt ashamed of the Xiao family. As the only son of the Xiao family, what could Your Majesty do? Maybe not give him a bright future? As for Tang Ning, everyone has seen how much His Majesty loves him throughout the imperial examination process, and today's incident has once again confirmed it. Not only does he have His Majesty's love, but he also has the status of the Tang family. From now on, his official career will definitely be beyond the reach of people like them. Thinking about it carefully, I can't help but feel a little sad. Although there is no distinction between princes and princes under the imperial examination, it is also an opportunity for ordinary people like them to rise to the top in one step, but whether they are poor people or children from humble families, they are always not as good as them. In the Tang family, Tang Zhao was still unconscious after being carried back by the family members. A middle-aged doctor came out of the room, cupped his hands to a gorgeous lady, and said, "Madam, the young master's body is fine except for 2 broken ribs. I have helped him repair the bones. During the day, he must rest in bed and remember not to move around." The woman nodded and ordered the maid behind her, "Dahong, take Dr. Zhou down to collect the consultation fee." After the middle-aged doctor went down, the woman looked at the 2 servants and said calmly, "What's going on?" The 2 of them knelt on the ground with a bang, and one of them said tremblingly, "Go back, madam, the second young master is going to the Black Tiger Gang to collect money from the Black Tiger Gang today," but unexpectedly, Tang Ning rushed in from outside, injured. He took the young master and asked the officials to arrest everyone in the Black Tiger Gang. The woman frowned and asked, "Cashier, why did he go to a rogue gang to collect money?" Before the 2 servants could answer, a figure hurriedly came from outside the door, looked at the woman, and asked, "Sister-in-law, what's wrong with Zhao?" The woman glanced at the 2 servants and said, "Just tell me." The servant immediately walked up to Tang Qi and said, "Back to the second master, let's go to the Black Tiger Gang to collect cash with you today." Black Tiger Gang. Upon hearing this, Tang Qi clenched his fists and asked, "Where is Zhao?" The servant immediately said, "Inside." Tang Qi strode in and looked at Tang Zhao lying on the bed, with a gloomy look on his face. The Black Tiger Gang is just a small gang in the capital, but it has inextricable connections with the Tang family, and these connections cannot be put on the table. If someone reveals those things, although the Tang family will not be shaken, there will still be some trouble. He looked at a servant and said in a deep voice, "You go and do something." Tang Shui stood at the door of the room, looking at Tang Zhao who was lying unconscious on the bed. He walked silently to the courtyard, his expression a little sad, and he sighed softly. Ping'an County Government. Because of a sudden case, Zhou Mingli was extremely busy. This case was a big one, involving dozens of abducted children. He sent out most of the county police officers to bring back beggars from Beijing. In addition, he also wanted to arrest those from the Black Tiger Gang everywhere. Help the public. Human trafficking is a capital crime. The leaders of the Black Tiger Gang will inevitably die, and the gang members below will, at the very least, be exiled. The Black Tiger Gang is just a small gang in Beijing. They usually bully the people and collect protection fees. As long as they don't do too much, the government has no time or energy to take care of it. But who would have thought that they secretly trafficked people and pretended to be beggars, taking advantage of the sympathy of the people, and using those children as their money-making tools? These people committed such a serious crime. As his first major case since his promotion, he must be treated with caution. Let's go. Move quickly. Several government officials escorted two beggars and walked in from the outside. When they saw Zhou Mingli, they immediately said, "Sir, we caught two more." Zhou Mingli looked at them, nodded and said, "Lock them in first, and don't let any of them go." The two government officials immediately responded and put the two beggars in jail. In the prison, the man with the scar on his face was held in solitary confinement, while the rest of the Black Tiger Gang were imprisoned in a cell. The man leaned against the wall, his eyes dull and his face ashen. "It's time to eat." A government servant came over and handed in 2 steamed buns and a bowl of water. The man with the scar remained unmoved. The officer stood at the door and said, "Eat, you don't have many meals left after doing this kind of thing. If anything happens, just deal with it honestly, and you don't have to suffer those flesh and blood. At least your wife and 2 children can live a better life outside." The scarred man raised his head, and the Yamen servant smiled at him and turned to leave. He walked to the cell door, picked up the bun, looked at it, and swallowed it. Zhou Mingli was pacing in the back hall of the county government office when Peng Chen came over and said, "Sir, the leader of the Black Tiger Gang has been recruited. He has confessed to the crimes they committed." Zhou Mingli looked at him and asked, "Why is the second young master of the Tang family there?" Peng Chen handed him the confession and said, "He said that the Black Tiger Gang must pay Tang Zhao a tribute every month. Tang Zhao is here today to collect money." Zhou Mingli frowned and said, "Is this case related to the Tang family?" Peng Chen shook his head and said, "He said that Tang Zhao didn't know about this. The Black Tiger Gang has been secretly trafficking people for many years. Tang Zhao started looking for him a year ago when someone from the Black Tiger Gang offended him. The gang is worried about the Tang family's background, so they provide money every month to ward off disasters." Zhou Mingli looked at the confession in his hand. The leader of the Black Tiger Gang confessed to the child trafficking and took the initiative to explain all the details. There were witnesses, physical evidence and oral confessions. At this point in the case, what he had to do was finished. As for how to judge this case, he alone cannot make the decision. The file needs to be submitted to the Ministry of Punishment. In such a serious case, the Ministry of Punishment must not be able to make arbitrary decisions. In the palace, Emperor Chen looked at Tang Qi, who was kneeling in the palace, and asked, "Why is this, I King?" Tang Qi raised his head and said, "I have failed to teach my son well, please punish me." Chen Huang put down a piece of paper in his hand and said, "Human trafficking by the Black Tiger Gang is a capital crime. Although Tang Zhao was involved with the Black Tiger Gang, he did not know about it. It is understandable. However, he is a son of an official, you should be more restrained after you go down." Tang Qi immediately said, "Thank you, Your Majesty, I will definitely have strict requirements on him in the future." Chen Huang looked at him, nodded, and said, "The leader of the Black Tiger Gang has committed a heinous crime. After verification by the Ministry of Punishment, he will be executed on the same day. The rest will be exiled 1,000 miles away." After he finished speaking, a eunuch went down to deliver the order. Emperor Chen looked at Tang Qi and said, "You go down first." "I excuse myself." Tang Qi bowed and excused himself. Ling Yun stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, the number of children abducted by the Black Tiger Gang is not quite right." Chen Huang stood up and said, "Let's investigate this case here." Ling Yun crumpled a piece of paper in his hand and said, "Yes." In another palace, Tang Ning, Xiaoju, and others have been waiting for a while. "I know you are unhappy with the Tang family." Xiaoju leaned against the pillar and said, "But the Tang family is the Tang family after all, and there are Prince Duan and concubine Hui in it. Even if the evidence is found, it is really hurt that the Tang family did this. Without their bones, let alone the Tang family, there is no way they can leave any evidence on this matter." He looked at Tang Ning and sighed softly. After what happened today, there was really no hope of reconciliation between him and the Tang family. This is not a good thing for him. Not to mention Prince Duan and concubine Hui in the palace, even the power of the Tang family in the court is definitely not something that a new champion can compete with. The Tang family can't do anything to him in today's matter, but the future is long. As long as he is here, if you go to court, you can't avoid the Tang family. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 206. Tang Ning looked at Xiaoju and asked, "Why are you sighing?" Xiaoju leaned against the pillar, put his hands behind his head, and asked, "Are you really going to completely break up with the Tang family?" It's not the first time that he has been at odds with the Tang family. He had been waiting for a long time to kick Tang Zhao today, and finally found the opportunity. Xiaoju looked at him and sighed, "You can't deal with the Tang family alone." Tang Ning looked at Xiaoju and asked, "Will you help me deal with the Tang family?" Xiaoju was stunned, looked up at the roof, and exclaimed, "The weather is good today." Tang Ning retracted his gaze. He was naturally not naive enough to think that this matter alone could bring down the Tang family. Although Emperor Chen was slightly dissatisfied with the Tang family, it was just dissatisfaction. As long as the Tang family did not do anything like treason, he would not touch the Tang family at all. And Emperor Chen treated him so well, Tang Ning also guessed part of his thoughts. No matter what Emperor Chen's motives were, it was not a bad thing. At a certain moment, the noisy hall suddenly became quiet. Several figures walked in from outside the hall, led by Tang Hui, the Minister of Rights. Tang Hui walked to the front, looked down, unfolded the imperial edict in his hand, and said, "Hereby appointing Tang Ning, the first place in the palace examination, as the Hanlin editor, Xiaoju, the second place in the palace examination, as the Yulan Dui, Gu Bai, the first place in the second place in the palace examination, as the Hanlin editor." Before the Qianglin banquet began, the emperor would grant official positions to some jinchi. Of course, the emperor would not come in person, and it was usually conveyed by the Ministry of Rights. If there were no accidents, all the first place in the palace examination would enter the Hanlin Academy. This time there were only 2 people in the first place, and Xiaoju was granted a military position. Although Gu Bai and Kui Lang were only in the second place, they were granted the first place position. Among the next 10 or so people, some entered the Hanlin Academy, and some were dispersed to the 6 ministries or other departments. The other jinchi had to go through the procedures of the Ministry of Personnel after the Qianglin banquet. The newly appointed jinchi, including the champion, were not granted high positions and had no real power, but the court's original intention was not to let them participate in politics, but to let them observe politics. Their status was similar to that of interns in later generations. They were familiar with the various procedures of the court in their respective positions. After 2 or 3 years of hard work, they would be granted real positions. Some of them who did not perform well and had no outstanding performance might waste their lives in the Hanlin Academy, but even so, they were the envy of countless officials. After the official appointment, the jinchi thanked the grace, and then the main show of the Qianglin banquet began. More than 200 jinchi, plus the officials and dignitaries in the court, set up more than 100 tables, which was larger than the Lumming banquet that Tang Ning had seen last time. The Lumming banquet had square tables for 8 people, while the Qianglin banquet had long tables for 4 people. The tables were low and required people to sit cross-legged. Xiaoju, Gu Bai, Kui Lang, and Shen Jian ranked high and all sat at the same table with him. Xiaoju sat next to Tang Ning and said, "Don't worry. Although I can't deal with the Tang family, I won't stand idly by when the Tang family deals with you." After Xiaoju finished speaking, a figure came over. Judging from his clothes, he should be a newly appointed jinchi. He held a wine glass, bowed to Tang Ning, and said with a smile, "Top scholar, I toast you." At the Qianglin banquet, not everyone drank and ate quietly. There were countless people walking around and toasting each other. Tang Ning stood up, raised his wine glass, and toasted the jinchi across the table. As soon as he sat down, Xiaoju pulled him up. "If you don't leave now, you will have to lie down and go back later." Xiaoju looked at him and said, "Every year's top scholar can't escape the fate of being drunk." Tang Ning looked up and found that many people had stood up and walked towards the side. Xiaoju was only concerned with avoiding, and he bumped into a figure. A young man in fancy clothes frowned, and his expression softened when he saw Xiaoju. Xiaoju steadied himself, looked up, and hurriedly bowed, "Your Highness, Prince Kong, I'm so sorry, sorry." It turned out to be Captain Xiao. Prince Kong waved his hand and smiled, "I haven't congratulated you yet, you got the first place in the palace examination." Xiaoju said modestly, "It's all luck." Prince Kong looked at Tang Ning standing beside him and asked, "Is this the new champion?" "Your Highness, Prince Kong has a keen eye." Xiaoju nodded and said, "He is the new champion Tang Ning." Tang Ning bowed slightly to him and said, "Meet your Highness, Prince Kong." "No need to be polite." Prince Kong smiled and said, "I heard of your name as early as the provincial examination, and I have been looking forward to meeting the talent that my Chen country has not seen for decades." Tang Ning smiled and said, "Prince Kong, you are too kind." Xiaoju looked at King Kong, suddenly looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Is your hand okay?" King Kong looked at the white cloth wrapped around Tang Ning's hand and asked, "Is the champion's hand injured?" "It's a long story." Xiaoju sighed and said, "We met a few thugs today. The champion was injured in the fight with the thugs." King Kong frowned and asked, "Who are the thugs who are so bold as to dare to attack you?" "Your Highness, you don't know." Xiaoju looked at him and said, "Today, the champion and I accidentally solved a big case. There are people who are doing the evil of human trafficking under the feet of the emperor in the capital. The champion and I saw injustice on the road, but if we hadn't met Tang Zhao, we could have caught those villains on the spot." King Kong raised his eyebrows, "Is this matter related to Tang Zhao?" "Tang Zhao is the son of Tang Qi, a Dongda official. Tang Qi is from the Tang family. The Tang family is the support of Prince Duan and a thorn in his side. He is very interested in the affairs of the Tang family. Including Tang Ning, the new champion who has a promising future and has some grudges against the Tang family, is also the one he wants to win over in recent days." "Why not?" Xiaoju looked at King Kong and said, "The champion's hand was injured by Tang Zhao, but this must be a misunderstanding. How could the Tang family do human trafficking? What do you think, King Kong?" Kong looked at him, smiled, and nodded, "Yes, the Tang family is the backbone of our dynasty, and it is naturally impossible for them to do such evil things." After he finished speaking, he picked up a glass of wine from the table, looked at Tang Ning, and smiled, "This king has admired the champion's talent for a long time. The champion is knowledgeable and has unique insights into political affairs. In the future, this king will have to ask the champion for advice." Tang Ning looked at him, picked up the wine glass, and smiled, "Your Highness is too kind. I have heard that your Highness is both virtuous and talented, and is proficient in both civil and military affairs. I should be the one to ask your highness for advice. After a while, after praising each other and drinking 2 glasses of wine, King Kong smiled and said, I still have some things to do. I will drink with the champion another day. King Kong stood up and left. Tang Ning looked at Xiao Ju and asked, isn't this too obvious? You don't understand. You need to learn more from me about these things. Xiao Ju patted his shoulder and said, next, you just wait and see the show. King Kong walked to a table in the front and sat down. A young man behind him stepped forward and whispered, Your Highness, young Master Xiao is using us. King Kong smiled and said, isn't it true that I am using them? Isn't it true that we are using each other? As long as our goals are the same, that's enough. His eyes swept from Tang Ning to Xiao Ju. Since the death of Empress Xiao and the death of the former crown prince, the influence of the Xiao family has been much less than before, but even so, this is still a force he longs for. Mr. Xiao had a son in his old age, and Xiao Ju is the only child of the Xiao family. If he can win him, wouldn't it be the same as winning the Xiao family? What's more, the new champion Tang Ning is knowledgeable and talented, with a unique vision. He is a very rare talent, and he is already in a stalemate with the Tang family. If he can become his helper and make plans behind him, wouldn't he be able to suppress Prince Duan again? He picked up the wine glass and smiled, let someone check the case carefully and don't miss any clues related to the Tang family. The man bowed and said, yes, I will arrange it immediately. This chapter is first published on AIU Voice Novel Network, please remember the website address. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 207. The one you just met was Prince Kong, and the one over there was Prince Huai. Prince Duan didn't come today, but you're in the Hanlin Academy, so you'll have many opportunities to see him in the future. Beside their table, many people lined up to get them drunk. Xiao Ju and him didn't go back, but stood there to introduce them. Prince Huai's power is not as strong as theirs, and he doesn't usually fight for anything. Prince Duan and Prince Kong often fight to the death over a small matter. You see, Prince Kong won't miss this opportunity. Even if this matter really has nothing to do with the Tang family, he will find a way to get involved with the Tang family. They fight back and forth, and in the end, no one knows who will get the position. Hey, I've been looking for you for a long time. So you're here. Xiao Ju was analyzing the situation for Tang Ning, when suddenly a figure walked out from behind the pillar. Prince Run was holding a box in his hand and putting something into his mouth. Tang Ning rarely saw the box in his hand leave his body. Xiao Ju looked down at Zhao Yuan and asked, why is His Royal Highness Prince Run here? I came to see if there is anything delicious here. Prince Run looked around and said, it's a pity that there is not even a mixed hot pot here. He looked at Tang Ning, held up the box in his hand, and said, I'll give these to you. How about you treat me to a mixed hot pot next time? Zhao Yuan's box contained the palace's secret pastries, which are hard to find outside. It would be good to take it back for Qing'er and the others to taste. Even if he doesn't exchange, he will come next time. Tang Ning nodded and said, deal. I'll fill your box now, Zhao Yuan said happily, and ran out happily. But it's Prince Run. Xiao Ju looked at Zhao Yuan's back as he ran away, shook his head and sighed. The royal family attaches great importance to seniority and respect for the young. The early death of the crown prince led to the scene of the 3 dragons competing for the throne, namely, Prince Duan, Prince Kong, and Prince Huai. Although Prince Run is the son of concubine Shu and has a noble status, he is still young. Unless Prince Duan and Prince Kong have an accident, the throne will not be his. Given Prince Run's kindness to Tang Ning, if he can succeed to the throne, the Tang family will have to think twice before doing anything else. Before the end of the Qianglin banquet, Zhao Yuan actually filled a box of cakes and stuffed the wooden box into Tang Ning's hand, saying, "It's settled. I'll come to you in a few days." Thinking of the little beggar, Tang Ning couldn't wait any longer. As soon as the banquet ended, he rushed to the county government's home as fast as possible. Qing'er paced in the yard. Tang Ning stepped into the yard and asked, "Is she awake?" "She woke up an hour ago." Qing'er walked to his side and pouted. "She ran away several times, but was caught by Sister Yao Yao every time." Tang Ning strode into the room and saw the little beggar sitting on the bed. When she saw someone coming in, she obviously shrank to the corner of the bed. When she saw that the person coming in was Tang Ning, the vigilance on her face relaxed a little. "I'm back." Tang Ning walked to the bed, looked at her, and asked, "Are you hungry?" The little beggar didn't say anything, but her stomach growled a few times. Tang Ning opened the box that King Run had given her and put it on the bed. She looked at the box but didn't reach out until Tang Ning took a piece of cake and handed it to her. Watching her eat in small bites, Tang Ning asked, "Do you still remember where your home is and who else is there?" She paused for a long time before she said in a very low voice, "My parents are dead, and my brother and sister are dead too." Tang Ning took a deep breath, looked at her, and said, "You will live here from now on. This is your home." She looked at Tang Ning and murmured, "Home." Tang Ning nodded, stretched out his hand, and said, "I'll take you out." The little beggar looked up at him, her clear eyes met his. After a long time, she finally stretched out her hand and held Tang Ning's hand. "This is Sister Xiaoi, this is Sister Xiru, this is Sister Yao Yao, this is Sister Qing'er." Tang Ning introduced them to her one by one. It was not easy to eliminate her vigilance against outsiders. Even towards Xiaoi and the others, she still had a slight vigilance and resistance. He could understand this slight resistance and vigilance. If she was not vigilant enough, it would be difficult for her, a girl, to survive outside. After introducing them to each other, Tang Ning stepped aside to let them get to know each other. Qing'er looked down at her and asked with a smile, "Xiao Xiao, how old are you this year?" She looked at Qing'er and whispered, 13. At the age of 13, she looked less than 10 years old due to long-term malnutrition. She was extremely thin, her face was sallow, and her hair was dull. Su Ru touched her hair with some pity and said, "You must eat well in the future to grow well." The woman's sympathy overflowed and she couldn't hold it back. Qing'er simply helped her wash her body during the day, and immediately ran to prepare hot water for her to take a thorough hot bath. Xiaoi found her beautiful clothes when she was a child, and Tang Yejing took out her jewelry and helped her try them one by one. After tossing for half an hour, the girl who appeared in front of Tang Ning again was already a girl with picturesque eyebrows, red lips, and white teeth. Her little face was no longer so dirty, and her messy hair was combed into a dovetail bun by Qing'er. She wore a pink long dress, and she no longer looked like a beggar. Instead, she looked like a daughter of a wealthy family. Qing'er couldn't help but exclaimed, "Xiao Xiao is so beautiful." The girl stood there in a daze, looking at Tang Ning with a slightly nervous look, as if she was not used to the current state and seemed a little at a loss. She had experienced too many things in this day. When Tang Ning brought her back to the room and brought in some fruits, she had already fallen asleep leaning against the bed. Tang Ning gently carried her to the bed and covered her with the quilt, and found 2 buns hidden at the foot of the bed. He looked at the 2 buns, and then looked at her frowning brows in her sleep. He did not move the 2 buns and gently covered the quilt. He left the room, and Zhonyi stood at the door and looked at him, asking, "Is Xiao Xiao asleep?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "She has fallen asleep." She looked at Tang Ning and smiled, "My husband finally found her." Tang Ning did not expect that happiness would come so suddenly, and his greatest wish was actually realized like this. Thinking about it now, it still feels like a dream. Zhongyi looked at him and said with some distress, "My husband must be exhausted these days, go to bed early today. After today, all the matters concerning the imperial examination are finally over." After experiencing ups and downs, especially after finding Xiao Xiao, his mind was up and down several times. He was indeed a little tired, and now he just wanted to have a good sleep. However, Xiao Xiao slept in his room. Xiru had always shared a room with Xiaoai, and he couldn't share with Qing'er and Tang Yao Yao. Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "I'll sleep in Hengzhou Pavilion these days. When the house is finished in a few days, I can move in." Zhonggai looked at his room and said, "That's the only way." Hengzhou Pavilion was not far from the county government office. It could be seen from the gate of the county government office. When Tang Ning walked over, it was almost curfew time. Manager Su was about to close the door. When he saw Tang Ning, he was startled at first, and then he was overjoyed and said, "Young master, why are you here?" Tang Ning smiled and said, "There's no room at home. I'm going to sleep here for a few nights these days." Manager Su hurriedly said, "Young master, come in quickly. The girls were just talking about you." When Tang Ning walked into Hengzhou Pavilion, several figures walked over quickly. "Sir, we saw you on the street today. You were riding a horse, so majestic. I knew a long time ago that you would definitely pass the imperial examination. Sir, why didn't you come to see us these days? Go away, you are the top scholar. You must be busy studying during this period. How can you have time to see you? Miss Chu Chu, Miss Ying Ying, Miss Yan Yan, long time no see." Tang Ning was surrounded by them and heard their laughter. He finally got some free time and fled back to his room with the excuse of being tired. He closed the door and breathed a sigh of relief. He sat back at the table and poured a glass of water. Everything in the room was exactly the same as before he left. The window was also kept the same. It seemed that Suhuli had not returned to Beijing yet. I don't know what she did outside Beijing. 2 months have passed and there is no news at all. I hope she is safe. He was really tired today. After drinking a glass of water, he took off his clothes and went to bed. He closed his eyes and soon his breathing became steady. At this time, it was late at night in the capital. In Tianrunju, a maid named Xiao Tao yawned. When she came to a room, she saw a figure sitting at the table. She was stunned at first, and then said in surprise, "Miss, you are back. Fortunate young gentleman." Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 208. Su Mei took off a black cloak, and Xiao Tao immediately came over, hung up the cloak, and said, "Miss, I will prepare the bath water for you." After a while, Xiao Tao closed the door, and the water vapor in the wooden barrel in the room steamed, shrouding the whole room in a cloud of mist. The bathtub was full of petals, and large patches of white and greasy skin were faintly visible. Xiao Tao stood behind Su Mei and asked, "Miss, do you still need to add hot water?" "No," Su Mei said lazily, and asked, "Has there been any major events in the capital recently?" "Big events," Xiao Tao thought for a while and said, "The West Chamber has been published, and after the young lady left, another book Peony Pavilion was published, both of which are very good." Su Mei opened her eyes, rolled her eyes at her, and said, "I'm asking if you have any major events. Is the palace examination over?" "The palace examination has been over for a long time, and tonight is the Qianglin banquet," Xiao Tao said with a smile. "Today we were still outside watching the champion riding a horse through the street, and the young lady must have guessed who is the champion." Su Mei thought for a moment and asked uncertainly, "Tang Ning?" Xiao Tao was stunned for a moment before she pouted and said, "So the lady already knew it." Su Mei looked a little strange. She was just guessing, but she didn't expect it to be him. Before the exam, everyone else would take the time to review their lessons, unlike him who played cards with her every other day. But even so, he was still the champion in the end, She thought for a moment, stood up from the bathtub, and said, "Have someone send me his information." During this period she walked out of the bathtub. Her delicate skin was white and rosy, as if the whole room was covered with a layer of pink. After a while, she leaned against the head of the bed, wearing a thin shirt, and flipping through a file in her hand. The first place in the provincial exam, quite impressive. Her face curved up, and her eyes continued to move down. Tang family, their identities were exposed so quickly, they actually ran away during the parade. What did they do? She was watching with great interest, and soon, Xiao Tao came in from outside and said, "Miss, you just returned to Beijing, you must be exhausted, it's almost midnight now, you should rest early." Su Mei closed the file in her hand, yawned, put the file aside, lay on the bed, and said, "I'm going to sleep. When you go out, close the door." Xiao Tao responded, extinguished the candle, left the room, and closed the door. On the bed, Su Mei closed her eyes, and opened them again after a while. After 2 months of running around, she almost didn't get a good night's sleep. She thought she could have a good sleep tonight, but after lying down, she felt uncomfortable and her sleepiness was slowly fading away. She began to miss that bed a little, and miss the smell that could make her feel at ease. After lying in bed for a while, she lost all sleepiness. She sat up from the bed and sighed leisurely. "It's dry, be careful of fire." The curfew had already begun in the capital at midnight. There was no one on the street except the night watchman and the occasional street patrol soldiers. After a team of patrol soldiers hurriedly passed by, a slightly thin figure walked out of the darkness and walked slowly on the street. She walked slowly and aimlessly, looking a little lonely in the dark night. Su Mei had long been accustomed to this. Loneliness was nothing unusual for her. When she passed the Ping'an County government office, she stopped at the gate for a moment and soon walked away. 100 steps further ahead was the Hongxiu Pavilion. The Hongxiu Pavilion was already pitch black. Even though she knew that the man was not here, she couldn't help but go around to the back. She walked to the wall, jumped lightly, and climbed onto the window sill of a room on the second floor. The window was closed. She sighed and was about to go down, but she pushed the window for some reason. Squeak! The window was easily pushed open by her. She was stunned for a moment, and then she climbed into the window skillfully. Although the room was pitch black, it made her feel at ease. She walked to the bed and lay down gently. Then she felt that her hand touched something. Tang Ning, who was sleeping, opened the hand on his buttocks and said vaguely, "So Fox, stop making trouble." Su Mei's arm froze, and she almost jumped up from the bed subconsciously. Then she realized that the voice just now was a little familiar, and the smell on the bed was even more familiar. She reached out and touched it in disbelief, and sure enough, she touched a figure on the bed. "I told you to stop making trouble." Another voice came from the darkness, and the corners of her mouth curled up slightly, and she whispered, "So Fox." She walked to the cabinet in the dark, took out a quilt, walked to the bed again, rolled the person on the bed in the quilt, and rolled to the innermost. Then she rolled herself into the quilt and closed her eyes. A familiar smell lingered in her nose, and she felt tired. Tang Ning was awakened by the smell in the morning. It was like the scent of roses, milk, or something else. He couldn't tell what it was, but it smelled good. He followed the smell and felt his nose itchy. Then he opened his eyes and saw Su Mei's face. His face was next to her hair, so he felt itchy. Last night he dreamed that he and Su Mei were sleeping on the same bed. Although they didn't do anything, Su Mei actually touched his butt in the dream. He felt ashamed to have such a dream, and he hasn't woken up from it until now. Not only did he not wake up, he was even more ridiculous. Su Mei and he were in the same bed, face to face, with one leg on his body, but fortunately her clothes were fully dressed. He thought about it, freed up his 2 hands, and pulled her face into a pancake shape. He had wanted to do this for a long time. The most beautiful woman in the capital, it looked ugly like this. He couldn't beat her in reality, but in his own dream, he could do whatever he wanted. But he didn't expect that in the dream, Suhuli's face was so tactile, and the look in her eyes when she opened her eyes was quite scary. Sumei's eyes were confused for a moment, and then she became sober. Tang Ning also woke up. He looked at Sumei and asked, "When did you come back?" "Last night." "Then why are you here?" Sumei looked at him and said, "Before you ask questions, can you get out of my bed first?" Tang Ning looked down and said, "This is my bed." Sumei turned her head and saw her quilt lying on the ground honestly. So she took back the leg that was on Tang Ning, sat up from the bed, and said nonchalantly, "Congratulations, number one scholar." Tang Ning couldn't quite understand her nonchalant attitude. They were both young men and women who had never experienced anything in life, and they were so passionate about each other. Sleeping in the same bed, wasn't she worried that something might happen? How could this woman not be on guard at all? He was sleeping well by himself, and when he woke up, there was a woman inexplicably in his bed, sleeping in the same quilt with him, and she could say to him nonchalantly, "Congratulations, number one scholar." This was not joy at all, but shock. "I'm glad you're back in Beijing." Tang Ning put on his coat, got off the bed, and said, "I'm leaving. I'll lock the door from the outside later. You can sleep a little longer." Sumei watched him walk out the door and lie back on the bed. It was not easy to get a good night's sleep, so she naturally wanted to sleep a little longer. However, although she liked sleeping in his bed, sleeping in the same quilt with him was not sleeping in the bed, but sleeping with a person. Thinking of the two of them sharing the same quilt with her legs on him, Sumei blushed slightly, spat secretly, and whispered, "Fox spirit, shameless." After saying that, she hugged the quilt and closed her eyes with a clear conscience. Tang Ning didn't expect Su Fox to return to Beijing so soon. She said at the beginning that it would be at least half a year at the latest. It seems that her life outside should be going well. No matter what, it's good to come back safely. Morning. He walked into the yard and said to Tang Yao Yao, who was practicing sword, walked past her, and planned to go back to the room to wash up. Tang Yao Yao sniffed, turned around, looked at him and said, "Stop." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 209. Tang Ning stopped, looked back at Tang Yao Yao, and asked, "What's wrong?" Tang Yao Yao walked over with a sword in hand, came close to Tang Ning, sniffed, and asked, "Why do you smell so good?" Tang Ning looked at her and said without changing her expression, "Maybe it's because I stayed with Miss Chu Chu and the others for a while last night. We haven't seen each other for a long time, and we chatted for a long time, so I got the smell of spices on them." "This is not the smell of spices." Tang Yao Yao shook her head and said, "This is the smell of flower petal bath." "Did you take a flower petal bath last night?" "A pure man like him took a flower petal bath. Suhu must have taken it yesterday. No wonder she smelled so good." "Then I don't know." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Maybe one of the girls washed it." "You wouldn't suspect that I didn't go to Red Sleep Pavilion last night. I went somewhere else. Shopkeeper Su can testify, Chu Chu girls can also testify." Tang Yao Yao glanced at him and said, "Where did you go last night, and what does it have to do with me?" Tang Ning looked at her, "Then you still ask me?" "I'm asking for Xiao Ai." She glanced at Tang Ning, turned around and walked out of the hospital. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "You haven't had breakfast yet, where are you going?" Tang Yao Yao didn't look back and said, "I'll go to Hungzhou Pavilion to ask how the business is going these days." Tang Ning wasn't worried about this and turned around and walked towards her room. Sumei didn't go through the front door. When she climbed through the window, no one saw her. The house won't be built for 3 to 5 days, which means that he still needs to sleep in the Red Sleep Pavilion for a while. During this time, Su Mei may come over again. He can't afford to offend a fox who can climb through the window and climb into the bed. However, for the sake of his own innocence and safety, he was still going to change rooms today. He walked to the door of the room, knocked on the door, and asked, "Xiao Xiao, are you up?" There was a rush of footsteps in the house, and the door opened quickly. The girl was wearing only a lining and no coat. She stood barefoot by the door and looked up at him. She should have jumped out of bed and ran over directly, but she didn't even wear any shoes. Tang Ning picked her up by the waist and placed her next to the bed. He filled a basin of water for her to wash her feet and said, "Remember to wear shoes next time. Get dressed quickly. Let's go have breakfast." She lowered her head and said softly. Xiao Xiao was still afraid of meeting strangers. Tang Ning originally wanted Qing'er to bring breakfast to the room, but after thinking about it carefully, more contact with people would still be helpful in changing her personality. "Come on, Xiao Xiao, eat more, and you won't be so thin in the future." My mother-in-law has also heard about her, and while picking up food for her, she frowned and said, "These unscrupulous people have done too many bad things, they will all be punished by God." She looked at Zhong Mingli and asked, "Has the case been solved?" "All the leaders and members of the Black Tiger Gang have been arrested." Zhong Mingli nodded and said, "This morning, the Ministry of Punishment brought all of them to the police. This case is too involved, and all those involved will definitely be severely punished." After dinner, Zhong Yisuaru and Tang Yaoyao took Xiao Xiao to the street to cut clothes. With Tang Yaoyao following them, nothing would happen. Tang Ning did not follow them and was going to find Lu Laoer and others. After the Black Tiger Gang was eliminated, there would be no fake beggars on the streets of the capital. It would be easier for them to establish a general helm in the capital. Qing'er held King Run's box and stuffed a piece of pastry into her mouth. When she walked past Tang Ning, she stopped and walked closer to him to smell it. She was surprised and said, "Uncle, why do you smell so good? Did you take a bath with rose petals?" Tang Ning looked at her. "Why would I take a bath with rose petals?" Qing'er wondered, "But where does the smell of rose petals come from?" "Kid, don't ask so many questions." Tang Ning snatched the box from her arms and said, "Stop eating it. If you get fatter, you won't be able to marry. It just smells like rose petals." Qing'er pouted, looking at Tang Ning's leaving figure, and said a little aggrievedly, "Besides, I don't have to get married in the first place." On a certain street in the capital, Tang Yaoyao was leading Zhong Yisuaru and Xiao Xiao to sweep one shop after another. She held her little hand and said generously, "Buy whatever you like. I'll pay." In a fabric shop somewhere, two women were chatting while selecting fabrics. "These girls are so pretty, I don't know whose family they belong to. That little girl has beautiful features and beautiful eyes. She will definitely be a beauty when she grows up. Your daughter is younger than her, I guess. You have to keep a close eye on your children. I heard that there is a group of people in the capital who specialize in stealing children, and when they succeed, they sell them out. Thanks to the #1 scholar. I heard about it too. I didn't even let her go out to play today. Those who kill 1,000 swords are not afraid of giving birth to children if they do this kind of thing. SHH, keep your voice down. I heard that this matter is related to the Tang family, but I can't let others hear it." Yesterday, Zhuang Yuanlang ran away inexplicably while he was parading in the street. Today, there is news. It turns out that Zhuang Yuanlang and Xiao Gonggai worked together to annihilate the Black Tiger Gang, which was a human trafficker. This caused great harm to the capital. When people in the street talked about this, they all praised it. 2 sentences. Human trafficking is common even under the feet of the emperor of the capital, and the people hate it even more. If the traffickers are caught outside the capital, most of them will be tied up and burned to death. The government will not intervene. Who doesn't have 1 or 2 children? Since the news came out, the people have paid special attention to this matter. In a hall in the palace, today's morning court is about to end. Wei Jian looked at Emperor Chen, stepped forward and said, "My lords, do you have anything else to report?" "I have a report." When the officials heard the voice, they all looked at a censor who stood up. The young censor held the tablet, stepped forward a few steps, bowed and said, "Your Majesty, there is a black tiger gang in the capital that is so bold and reckless that they kidnap children. It is unacceptable to heaven and law. I don't know how many people have been poisoned by them. I beg your Majesty to investigate this matter thoroughly, properly place those kidnapped children, and give the people a clear sky." Emperor Chen looked at him and said, "Haven't I handed this case over to the Ministry of Justice?" The censor bowed again and said, "Your Majesty, the Black Tiger Gang is just a small gang. If there is no backing, Jing, how can he stay in the capital? Such a shameless thing has been going on for several years. I think there must be someone behind this. I beg your Majesty to investigate it thoroughly." Emperor Chen looked at him and asked, "What do you think?" The young censor glanced at King Kong with a hidden look and said loudly, "This case is too serious. I think it should be tried by the Ministry of Justice, the Dali Temple, and the Censorate. Only in this way can we give an explanation to the people." As soon as these words came out, the hall fell into a moment of silence. The officials had different faces and didn't know what to think. The second son of the Tang family was found in the Black Tiger Gang, which implicated the Tang family in this case. If this case went to the Ministry of Justice, it would not have much impact on the Tang family. But the Dali Temple was different. The Dali Temple rarely investigated cases, but when it did, it was a big case, often related to powerful officials in the capital. More importantly, the Dali Temple was the wing of King Kong. How could he miss this opportunity to attack the Tang family? The last censors are all a group of people who only recognize reason and law. Not to mention that this matter is related to the Tang family, even if it is related to Prince Duan and Prince Kong, they will definitely investigate it to the end. This case has been investigated to this point, and it is no longer just a case of human trafficking by the Black Tiger Gang. This is a contest between Prince Duan and Prince Kong, and the Tang family has undoubtedly been pushed into the center of this storm. And from the current situation, Prince Duan is undoubtedly at a disadvantage. If the Tang family is damaged in this storm, Prince Duan will not only lose a lot of strength, but also his reputation among the people will also be greatly reduced. This move of Prince Kong directly tied himself to the people and the law, and he was invincible from the beginning. Emperor Chen glanced around below and nodded, "What you said makes sense, this case will be tried by the three courts." Somewhere in the palace, the corners of Prince Kang's mouth curled up a little, and beside him, a young man in gorgeous clothes had a gloomy face. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 210. Tang Ning was appointed as a 6th-rank Hanlin editor, a low-ranking official who did not have to attend court. In fact, the Hanlin Academy was full of noble officials who did not have much to do on weekdays. Punching in and out of work was exactly what Tang Ning longed for. Although he had been appointed, he still had 3 months to take office. Although he could start work early, he still had some things to do in these 3 months. First of all, of course, was to make money. He had not started work yet, and did not even have a salary, so he naturally had to find a way to support his family. With the meager offerings from the Hanlin Academy, he could only make a living. The more silver, the better. In addition to supporting his family, the beggars' gang, which could be self-reliant in most things, also had places where they needed to spend money. He was not Tang Yao Yao, who could gamble away $1 million fortune, and had a father with a fortune of more than $1 million. His happy life depended on his own hard work. Tang Yao Yao used a wooden stick to gently hit him and said, "Raise your arm a little higher." Although Tang Ning was busy during this period, he did not neglect to practice martial arts. He asked Tang Yao Yao and the old beggar. There is no clear division in the martial arts world. Thinking carefully, it seems impossible to have a specific measurement method. However, although there is no specific division, there are still vague boundaries. Third-rate masters can already be called masters of the mainstream. The old beggar has the most say in this matter. According to him, Peng Chen and Tang Yao Yao are both at this level. Tang Yao Yao is a little stronger and is probably at the top of the third rate, but still a distance from the second rate. Those who can be classified as second rate are already considered strong. Li Tianlan, who broke through the realm, is one of them, and Ling Yun, the guard beside the emperor, is also one of them. Tang Ning only knows these two young masters. As for first-rate masters, they are extraordinary. Although they are not rare, each of them is a giant in the world of martial arts and has the ability to establish a school. Tang Ning felt that Zheng the butcher should be considered one, and as for the old beggar, he might be considered powerful among the top masters. Of course, these were too far away from him. According to the current classification of the strength of martial artists in the martial arts world, he should be considered as a low-level person, and there is still a long way to go before he can reach the third-rate level. However, although his strength was not strong, it was still easy to climb over a wall or a window. Tang Ning had only been practicing martial arts for a short time, and he was very satisfied with his current progress. He walked to the corner, squatted down, looked at the old beggar and asked, "What level has Miss Sue's martial arts reached?" "You mean that little fox?" the old beggar burped and said, "She can barely be considered second-rate, but if she really fights, your two little lovers combined are no match for her." "Which two?" The old beggar glanced at Li Tianlan, who had just walked in, and then looked at Tang Yao Yao, whose sword speed was getting faster and faster, and said, "It's rare to have natural charm. If you want to turn her into a little lover, do it as soon as possible. If you miss this opportunity, you will never have it again." "You old frivolous man, what little lover, how ugly it sounds." As for natural charm, Su Mei has nothing to do with the word charm except that her name has the word charm. Lying on the same bed with her, I didn't feel where her charm was. He stood up and walked over, looking at Xiao Xiao, who was sitting in a daze in the yard, and introduced to Li Tianlan, "This is Xiao Xiao, now my sister." He looked at Xiao Xiao again, "This is Sister Li." Xiao Xiao looked up at her and whispered, "Sister Li." By now, Xiao Xiao no longer had that kind of vigilance and defense against the people Tang Ning introduced to her. Tang Ning poured her a cup of tea and asked, "You should leave, right?" Li Tianlan nodded and said, "At most a few months, after discussing all the details with the court, we will set off to return to Chu." Tang Ning calculated that they had stayed in Chen for nearly a year, and it was time to go back. He thought for a while and asked, "Will you come again next year?" Chu had to pay tribute to Chen every year. When one group of envoys left, another group of envoys arrived. Li Tianlan took a sip of tea and said, "The tribute has become once every 3 years. In the future, I may not come." Tang Ning knew that her identity should not be an envoy, but he didn't know what her specific identity was. He looked at Li Tianlan, sized her up, and asked, "Are you the princess of Chu?" The royal family of Chu was surnamed Li, and all the envoys were respectful to her. She was a girl, but she was able to pass the imperial examination. She must have a powerful background in Chu. This was Tang Ning's guess. Li Tianlan shook her head and said, "No. But you are not an envoy either." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "What is your identity?" Li Tianlan looked at him, smiled mysteriously, and said, "You will know when you come to Chu." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Then there should be no chance." After Li Tianlan returned to Chu, if nothing unexpected happened, there would be no chance to see each other again. Although there is no banquet that will not end, they are brothers who have lived and died together, so he asked her to drink 2 more cups of tea. After Li Tianlan left, Tang Yaoyao stopped practicing and sat opposite him, hiding the joy on her face, and asked, "Is she going home?" "Yes." Tang Ning sighed and said, "She will leave in a while." Tang Yaoyao looked at him and asked, "Are you reluctant to leave her?" "It's natural to be reluctant to leave a friend," Tang Ning said, suddenly looked at her and asked, "When will you return to Lingzhou?" Tang Yaoyao glared at him and said, "I can go back whenever I want. Do you care?" Tang Ning looked at her and explained, "What I mean is, if you are not in a hurry to go back, I have something to discuss with you." He was planning to open a bookstore in the capital. There had already been successful cases of The Romance of the West Chamber and The Peony Pavilion. Opening a bookstore was almost a guaranteed profit-making business. However, he didn't have enough money and needed to find an angel investor. Tang Yaoyao looked quite like an angel. "Open a bookstore, let's cooperate." Tang Yaoyao thought for a while and said, "Okay." Rich man Tang's daughter still had a keen eye and agreed without hesitation. She thought for a while and said, "What should the bookstore be called? How about calling it Yao Yao Zai?" "It sounds too unpleasant." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Let's call her Tang Ning Zai. It sounds much better than Yao Yao Zai." Tang Yaoyao narrowed her eyes and looked at him. "Otherwise, I have a compromise." Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "Combining our names will put you in the front. What do you think?" "Yao Yaning." Tang Yaoyao shook her head, "It sounds awful." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Each person takes one word." "Yao Ningzai." Tang Yaoyao thought for a while and said, "It doesn't sound good either." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "How about taking your Tang and taking my Ning?" The people of the capital have been paying close attention to a case in the past 2 days. The Black Tiger Gang was involved in human trafficking, and the Tang family was also involved. His Majesty ordered the Criminal Department, Yashitai and Dali Temple to conduct a joint trial, hoping to get to the bottom of this case. In previous years, there were only a few joint trials of the 3 divisions. Once the 3 divisions were alerted, beheading would be the lightest result. In serious cases, Ling Chi might even be sentenced. After the leader of the Black Tiger Gang heard about this, he hit the wall in prison and committed suicide that night. Although he still lost his life, he also ended up with a whole body. The leader of the Black Tiger Gang committed suicide in fear of crime. However, after inspection by the 3rd Division, no direct relationship between the Tang family and the Black Tiger Gang's human trafficking was found. However, the second son of the Tang family used the Tang family's momentum to repeatedly cover up the Black Tiger Gang's oppression of the people. And the actual evidence was found. There was great public dissatisfaction with this case. In consideration of Tang Zhao's injury, although His Majesty did not punish him too severely, he also made a decree that he would never be employed. After this incident, Tang Zhao's official career was completely ended. At the same time, a minister belonging to the Tang family faction in the household department was inexplicably transferred out of the capital. Although his official rank remained unchanged, from then on, the Tang family and Prince Duan had almost no manpower in the household department. These are also regarded as one of His Majesty's punishments for the Tang family. In short, this battle between the 2 kings ended with King Kang's victory. Prince Duan's mansion. The furious King Duan had already smashed several teacups and cursed, "Idiots, they are all idiots." On the contrary, in Prince Kang's mansion, Prince Kang was all smiles, holding 2 women in his arms, took a sip of wine, and said with a smile, "Come here, prepare 2 generous gifts, one to the Xiao mansion, and the other to the Xiao mansion." The number 1 scholar. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 211. It takes a genius to remember the address of this website in 1 second. Fastest update. No ads? The outcome of the Black Tiger Gang case did not surprise Tang Ning. Even if the Tang family is really behind the scenes, it is impossible for them to end up personally when doing these things, let alone be caught with any fatal consequences. Tang Zhao's punishment cannot be said to be painless. After all, he is also an important figure in the younger generation of the Tang family. Even if he fails in the imperial examination, he can easily enter the official career. Now that his career has been blocked due to his involvement in the Black Tiger Gang, there may be some losses for the Tang family, but it is not big. The transfers in the officialdom have nothing to do with this case, but more to do with the game between King Kong and King Duan. Obviously, this time, it ended with King Kang's absolute victory. From a personal emotional point of view, Tang Ning is of course happy to see the Tang family suffer. It is better for King Kong to be proud than for King Duan to be proud. How could he not avenge his murder? If he could weaken the Tang family even a little bit, he wouldn't mind making up for it. Qing'er ran in from outside, leaned her head close to him and took a sniff. When she saw Tang Ning looking at her, she immediately said, "Uncle, there is a girl outside looking for you." If it was Li Tianlan, she would walk in directly without announcing anything. Qing'er said this, which meant that she didn't recognize him. Could it be Sumei? She didn't go to Hongxiu Pavilion in the past 2 days, but thinking about it, she wouldn't have anything to do with her. Tang Ning walked outside the county government office and saw Tang Shui standing at the door. Tang Shui looked at him and said softly, "I have something to say to you. This is not the place to talk. Come with me." Tang Ning walked out of the county office and walked to Hongxiu Pavilion. She greeted shopkeeper Su and the others before walking up to the second floor. When she opened the door and walked into the room, Tang Ning was startled when she saw Su Mei sleeping soundly on the bed. Although he had nothing to explain to Tang Shui, it was still a little bad for people to see Su Hu sleeping on his bed. He walked over, pulled her quilt upward, covered her head, and then lowered the bed curtain. After doing all this, he walked to the table and poured a cup of tea. Tang Shui walked in from outside. She sat opposite Tang Ning, looked at him, and said, "Although it's a little late, I still want to congratulate you, #1 winner." Tang Ning did not speak. He knew that Tang Shui still had something to say. "I know it's impossible for you to return to the Tang family." She looked at Tang Ning and said, "But I want to ask you something, and I hope you can agree to it." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "What's going on?" Tang Shui stared into his eyes and said, "If you have a chance, can you see her?" Tang Ning knew who she was talking about and asked, "Any chance?" Tang Shui explained, "My sister-in-law is confined at home by them. It is difficult for her to leave the house on weekdays. I will find a way to let her out. I hope you can see her by then." Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "I promise you." This was not an excessive request, and he had no reason to refuse. Even though he was no longer the Tang Ning they thought he was, and he was destined to have no family relationship with that young lady from the Tang family, but the connection with this body was completely broken. If you don't drop it, you won't be able to separate it clearly. Tang Shui looked at him, his eyes a little moist, lowered his head and said, "Thank you." "You're welcome." Tang Ning smiled, thought of something, and asked, "I have something to ask you." Tang Shui looked at him and said, "You should call me sister." Tang Ning did not dwell on the topic and asked, "Have you ever seen anyone with a broken arm in the Tang family?" Broken arm? Tang Shui looked at him, thought for a moment, and said, "Uncle Han went back to his hometown to visit relatives last year, met an enemy, and broke an arm." Tang Ning thought for a while and asked, "It was October last year, right?" Tang Shui looked at him and said in surprise, "How do you know?" Tang Ning just smiled and said no more. Tang Shui looked at him, as if he had thought of something, and his body trembled slightly. When he looked at Tang Ning again, 2 traces of tears streaked down his pretty face. He held Tang Ning's hand tightly and said in a trembling voice, "I'm sorry." The expression on Tang Ning's face was a little painful. It wasn't because she was going through some torture in her heart, but because she was pinched by Tang Shui. He took his hand out without leaving any trace, and while rubbing his palms under the table, he said, "This has nothing to do with you." Tang Shui looked at him and said solemnly, "You must be careful." Tang Ning nodded and said, "Don't worry, I can do it." Tang Shui took out a paper bag from his sleeve and said, "My sister-in-law gave this to you." Tang Ning took the paper bag and opened it, seeing some exquisite pastries inside. "My sister-in-law made these all by herself." Tang Shui stood up and said, "It's late, I'll leave first. If you have anything, ask someone to send me a message." Tang Ning walked her to the door, walked back, and closed the door. A slender arm opened the bed curtain, looked at him dissatisfied, and said, "Are you going to cover this girl to death?" Tang Ning saw a pair of silkworms lying under her eyes and asked casually, "You are not just the shopkeeper of Tianatianju, you look like you are very busy." Su Mei got off the bed, looked at him, smiled charmingly, and said, "Brother, it's not a good thing for a man to be too curious about women." Tang Ning pinched a piece of pastry and said, "Sister, if you don't want to tell me, forget it. I have no curiosity about you." "Eldest sister," Su Mei glared and said angrily, "Who do you call eldest sister?" Tang Ning glanced at her and said, "You are 3 years older than me. If I don't call you elder sister, should I call you younger sister?" "You," Su Mei looked at him, her chest rising and falling. Tang Ning was worried that her clothes would be torn by her. Su Mei put her hands on her hips and got angry for a while. Then she smiled again and said, "A woman who is 3 years older than her husband will bring him gold bricks. Have you heard that? Several fortune tellers say that I am a lucky charmer. Do you want to consider it?" Tang Ning opened her hand that was reaching for the cakes on the table. She was born with a charming body. Her lucky charm for her husband was fake. Her unlucky charm for her husband was real. Whoever married her would die young. "No need." He shook his head and said, "I'm a married man." "What's wrong with having a family?" Su Mei glanced at him and said, "How many married men in the capital keep vixens outside? You keep the most beautiful woman in the capital. Are you really not tempted at all?" After eating a piece of cake, Tang Ning drank a glass of water and said, "I think my wife is the most beautiful woman in the capital." Su Mei suddenly looked at him and looked him up and down. For some reason, Tang Ning felt as if he was being stripped naked for exhibition. He couldn't help but shudder and asked, "What are you looking at?" Su Mei looked at him for a while and suddenly asked, "Are you really married?" Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Can't you find out everything?" "I can find out." Su Mei walked up to him and asked in confusion, "But you've been married for almost a year, why are you still a virgin?" Tang Ning grabbed a piece of cake and stuffed it into her mouth as quickly as possible. Su Mei looked at him with some dissatisfaction, sat down, and ate the cake attentively. After she finished a piece, she picked up another one and praised, "The cakes made by Miss Tang are really delicious. Hey, don't eat it anymore. Leave me another piece, half a piece." Tang Ning gave her half of the last piece and asked curiously, "Can you teach me, that, how to see that?" Su Mei glanced at him, "Which one?" "It's Tong, that one." "Oh, you ask me how I can tell that you are still a virgin." Su Mei looked at him, smiled mysteriously, and said, "This is the secret of our sect, of course I can't tell you." "If she doesn't want to tell, then don't tell. He will go back and ask the old beggar. It's just a jar of wine." He took the cake back from Su Mei, stuffed it into his mouth, and said, "I'm leaving, you sleep slowly." Stingy Su Mei glanced at him, took out the cake she had just hidden, and showed reluctance on her face. She murmured, "It would be nice if I could eat it often." Tang Ning returned to the county government office. As soon as he walked back to the yard, Zhong Yi came up to him and asked, I heard from Ching Er that your husband just left with a girl.